Could I welcome those that are watching on live stream and remind our councillors please to turn off your cell phones, and we will take a break to clear urgent messages. It just depends on the flow of the meeting. And could I give you a bit of an overview of Delta 2? That we are now allowed 50 on each floor, and the protocol in here that council have, thank you Una, have been very clear with us. You need your mask on when you're coming into the building. Once you're seated, you can take your mask off. So, and that applies to us all. But when we're up and walking around, and there'll be no morning tea, so we have got water for this meeting. And for our council staff, could I thank them too, Jeff, for the way that they've managed this Delta 3 transition into it, and now in this still in Delta 2. So they have been seamless, and I mentioned that at a previous council meeting, so congratulations to the staff. It's no mean feat actually, keeping the wheels of council moving, services outwardly to our community and ratepayers, and also keeping up with the major meetings that we're all involved in. So well done on that. There will not be lunch today, but we've all been instructed of that, so I don't know what your plans are there. So I will now ask Councillor Kai Fong, would you like to open our meeting please with the council prayer?
Morena koutou, kia inoi tātou. Tūtawa mai I runga, tūtawa mai I raro, tūtawa mai I roto, tūtawa mai I waho, kia tau ai, te mauri tū, te mauri ora, ki te katoa, homi e, hui e, tae ki.
Kia ora. And Te Wiki o Te Reo Māori was amazing, wasn't it? When you looked at how the uptake of the reo is amazing, and also we note that Te Tata o Te Arawa have managed to attract some funds to also continue proceeding with the reo. So do I call for apologies? Are there any apologies? There appear to be none. We're all here and you're very wet out there. So we'll move on now to declarations of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? There appear to be none. Are there any urgent items not on the agenda? There appear to be none. We move on now to the confirmation of minutes. The council minutes on the 26th of August. I need a mover and a seconder that the minutes of the council meeting held on the 26th of August be a true and correct record. Councillor Yates, Councillor Kumar. Is there any correcting of the minutes? There appear to be none. I'll put the motion to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. The council minutes on the 31st of August. I need a mover and a seconder that the minutes of the council meeting held on the 31st of August 2021 be confirmed as a true and correct record. Have a mover. Councillor Donaldson, seconder. Councillor Kai Fong. Is there any correction of the minutes? There appears to be none. I'm going to put that to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye. Thank you. Carried. Move now to recommendations from other committees. The recommendation from the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee. I need a mover and a seconder for the motion that the recommendations from the Strategy, Policy and Finance Committee held on the 9th of September be received. Moved Councillor Yates, seconded Councillor Roe Kawa-Tate. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. We move now to recommendation 1, Kaharoa and Penny Road Rally Sprint, objection to proposed closure. Stavros is here to clarify any questions that we may have. There appear to be none. Is there a mover and a seconder for the motion that council approve the temporary closure of Kaharoa and Penny Roads for the event? Moved, Councillor Yates. Seconded, Councillor Wang. So a round of discussion, and I'll open for discussion. The mover, you have the first right, and then Councillor McPherson.
Kia ora. Through you, Madam Chair, I seek clarification regarding some misinformation that was stated by Councillor McPherson at the SPNF on that particular date. We claimed he'd contacted a number of named residents from Kaharoa that stated their opposition. I've since received an email from one of the named residents, which I won't name today, because he didn't agree, nor was he contacted by Councillor McPherson. So I would just like to ask that that statement, if Councillor McPherson would consider withdrawing that particular statement, because I have an email here and I'm happy to submit that. The individual named was not happy that they were publicly named in a public meeting of council.
Councillor McPherson, do you wish to respond?
Yes, thank you.
To?
With regard to the consultations that were conducted, they were conducted at pace by myself and the complainant, and I can't recall which of us spoke to each of the various people. So the point that you make is misses the main point. That is, there's a degree up that road of discontent. My own view is that the discussion that we had at the SPNF covered the ground satisfactorily. We also determined that there would be further consultations and review of these positions in preparation for next year's event, with the possibility that the event will be moved. And so I think this is a little bit, this complaint is a little tendentious, and I think the main point should be that we acknowledge that there is a degree of discontent, and that's been acknowledged and was dealt with satisfactorily, in my view, at the SPNF committee meeting.
Councillor McPherson, my request to you, did you wish to respond to the point that Councillor Yates made about incorrectly naming somebody that you apparently phoned?
The statement I made at the meeting, Chair, was that a range of people had been contacted. I did not specify those that had been contacted by me or by the person I was working with.
Point of order.
Point of order, Councillor.
So it's technically not misinformation at all.
You named them specifically.
You must know.
Yes, I did.
Chair this.
Yes.
Your point of order?
They were named specifically.
Right. In light of that, and I heard you say that you had an email. Are you prepared to table that?
I'm prepared to table this email. The email clearly states that the individual named, I have not objected to anything. They wanted to see documentation, so links to our meeting were sent to the individual named. Hi Mercia, people cannot object on my behalf. Really happy to submit that.
Do you wish to respond?
Yes, I accept that that could well be accurate, and that the as I said, the consultations were done at pace by phone, and it was a very quick survey. And but thank you for raising it.
Thank you for responding, and I will make a ruling that we should, considering the response from Councillor McPherson, we should receive the tabled email, and we will reflect this decision in the minutes of the incorrect information. Thank you, Councillor Yates. Was there anything else that you wish to speak to about the motion?
No, other than the named individual was very supportive of this going ahead in the Kaharoa district.
Right, and Councillor McPherson, you wish to speak?
It was on that matter that I wish to speak, but the issues have been traversed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Nobody else wishes to speak? Councillor Donaldson?
Thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate my colleague raising this concern of the particular individual, and it reinforces my view around this particular decision of Council to approve the temporary closure of Kaharoa and Penny Roads for the event. Events are struggling right now, and we need to be doing everything we can to enable those events, and I'm confident, even more confident today after hearing what I've just heard, that there is, on balance, a significant degree of support in that community for that event to take place, so I'm happy to support.
Okay, anybody else? There appears not to be, so I'm going to put the motion to the vote that Council approve the temporary closure of Kaharoa and Penny Roads for the event. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? The motion is carried. Thank you. We move now to staff reports. The recommendation, the Three Waters reform. I need a mover and a seconder to receive the report, that the report Three Waters reform preliminary council position be received. Do I have a mover? Councillor Donaldson, seconder. Councillor Kai Fong. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? Carried. Welcome, Stavros, to the meeting, and there's a lot of discussion around this and a lot of public interest in this. So it's wonderful this has come to Council. Thank you, Gina, for co-presenting with Stavros. Mr. Markle, over to you.
Morena kotu kato. Through you, Madam Chair, just for the record, I want to start accepting that the report has been tabled and got a presentation to go through. However, I also would like to sort of identify what my role in the organisation is. That this Deputy Chief Executive with specific responsibilities to pursue infrastructure and environmental outcomes. At a professional level, I am a registered and chartered professional engineer. My field of practice is the construction, maintenance and management of municipal infrastructure. I do have some 35 years of experience in that field of practice, and therefore I think it is quite important to navigate through these reform proposals within the context of both the engineering and municipal infrastructure management context as we go through. I have with me my colleague Gina Rangi, which is working together into these proposals, understanding the impacts and implications of these proposals on our council, while at the same time we're cognizant of and familiar with the national context, but nevertheless our responsibility is to give you, our elected members and governance boards, our professional advice with regards to these proposed reforms. Start with by obviously saying that the community at large has and should have an active interest in any proposals regarding the current and future management of Three Waters. Three Waters are not called lifeline utilities by accident in terms of our civil defence and emergency management. They are pivotal to the health and safety of our community. They're pivotal to its environmental outcomes and pivotal, obviously, to our economic growth and prosperity aspects of our communities. And therefore, our communities do and they should have a significant and active interest in the development of these emerging proposals. I think it's also important to acknowledge there is a lot of uncertainty into that sphere by a lot of local authorities across the country. So it is quite important, in my view, that we take a stock of where the reforms are at the moment and what we've been asked to do in the stage of proposing these reforms, as opposed to some particular views, that are expressed, in the community. So the purpose here is obviously to address, what the proposed reforms are, is to highlight some key points of the proposed reforms, and to make sure that elected members note we propose a preliminary position to be endorsed by the Council in order to inform the Government and the Department of Internal Affairs, so they can further refine and adjust their proposals accordingly. So our final recommendation here obviously is for elected members to endorse the preliminary position of the proposed reforms and to support officers continuing to work with the Department of Internal Affairs. So on the face of it, what are the government's stated objectives? And you can see in front of you there are a number of key objectives, such as improving public health and well-being, improving environmental outcomes, enabling growth and employment in the districts, supporting and enabling housing and urban development, adapting to the impacts of emerging climate change effects, and to mitigate the effects of natural hazards. I don't think that there is anything substantial objectionable to that particular set of objectives. I think we embrace them, and certainly we support these key objectives. The question for us is, having agreed to a set of objectives, the question revolves around how do we best give effect to these objectives. It's not a matter of whether we agree with the objectives or not, because certainly we do agree. The question is, what is the process proposed to give effect to these kind of objectives? The government has identified a number of concerns with regards to the current challenges faced by Three Waters services managers across the whole country. I think it's important to note that we have identified similar challenges in our various infrastructure planning documents, in our LTP, and so on. And as you can see in front of you there, there is concern about the safety and quality of drinking water. I think that is built primarily on the event that took place in the Havelock North in a couple of years ago. But also it's highlighted by the fact that across the whole country, very few TLAs actually at the moment are able to state clearly that they comply with drinking water standards. We are one of the few that do comply with drinking water standards. There is a concern about the resiliency of the Three Water services, especially in the face of emerging natural events and natural threats to the continuity and reliability of these services. There is a threat and a risk about the financial sustainability and affordability of the services. I would like to note that for the elected members, that in the previous LTP from 2018 to 2028, the nation was dedicating somewhere in the region of about $1.4 billion a year into the Three Waters infrastructure. In the 2021 to 2031, that investment has increased to $2.7 billion a year. Having ahead of us a horizon of emerging new regulations, new standards, facing an aging infrastructure across the whole country, facing the prospect and the need to invest for growth, facing the need to enable a collaborative approach with many parts of our communities to make sure that services are fit for purpose and subordinate to our LTP objectives. There is always going to be a financial stress in delivering these three water services. So we do recognize those kind of financial impacts and affordability concerns by all the communities, but specifically for our own community. There are concerns about sector skills and capability scarcity. We've talked about it through our LTP and talked through our various reports in the near past about a situation where more people retiring out of the sector than new people coming into the sector. A classic example for us in our own infrastructure organization here, I've got 7 senior positions in our infrastructure. 4 of these positions are engineering background, engineering qualifications. 2 are science qualifications, and 1 of them is a business qualification. The 4 engineering senior managers and senior positions, we are all in our 60, 62, 63, 64 years of age. We're taking steps at the moment to supplement and bring younger people into the front line and taking over responsibilities, and we coach them and we train them to succeed in our passing. But however, our micro picture here is repeated across the whole country. And therefore, when you look into the government concerns, you cannot help yourself to say, yes, there is a problem. There's also a concern about equitable access to the 3 water services. The dashboard identification the government, the stock that has been taken, it identified there are a significant number of private schemes of water supplies. There are 63 registered water supplies, only 8% are compliant. We are one of them. Improving coordination of limited national resources, and again, it should not be come as a surprise to anyone that the costs of delivering services, procuring materials, technology, access to methodologies and so on is becoming more scarce and more difficult to attain. And therefore, the concerns of the government, and they are asking the questions, these proposed reforms, how can we best address a better integration and coordination of limited national resources, and obviously improving transparency and accountability is also one of their key objectives. So in broad terms, we support and we agree with those concerns, and we have taken a number of steps in our current and future planning to address this kind of concerns and risk as best as we can. So having identified what the government's concerns are and their key objectives, the question is revolving around what does the government propose to address these kind of concerns? Although there has been a lot of recent discussion by the community of these proposed reforms, it's fair to say that at the technical level, we have been involved into conversations with our colleagues across the country, the Department of Internal Affairs, we have national steering groups at the technical level, and our professional industry, where we discuss regularly these kind of issues. So the government basically at the moment is proposing that the action to be taken, it will be based on an amalgamation of service delivery, and the amalgamation is aiming to achieve integrated benefits of scale. And those benefits of scale will be underpinned by an integrated and central set of regulations by the central water regulators. Those regulations will further underpinned by national legislation that the government is proposing or is promoting through the Parliament at the moment, through the Water Services Bill. So basically what the government says that amalgamation and regulation will deliver some benefits of scale. And those regulations will be universal and will be applied to every water services authority. Now, on the face of it, at face value, there are benefits of scale. And again, I think I would like to remind all of us, and for us who've been into the local government industry for a number of years, I think we should not ignore the fact, or should not neglect the fact, that in the last 20 or 30 years, the current 67 TLAs that operate in the country are a product of earlier amalgamations. It was only in the 1990s that gradual amalgamations have taken place and the number of TLAs have been reduced. So, and again, you can well imagine that even in the Rotorua district boundaries, you can imagine that having a Tarawera Borough Council or a Nongodaha Borough Council or a Rotuti Rotoma Borough Council would not be any more efficient than actually having a central district council. Decisions have been made to bring all these boroughs together because the intention and the objective and the realization is that having consolidation of all these many boroughs into a single local authority derives benefits of scale. At the organization level, we do the same thing too. As an infrastructure and environment group, I do not employ my own accountants or my own IT persons or my own public communications or governance advisors. We share services at the organizational level. So on the face of it, when the government talks about benefits of scale, there is a valid case behind it. And there is a history behind it, and we actually have been practicing that for a number of years. The key point in these proposed elements of the government's reform, of course, is that is how territorial local authorities who have the primary accountability in the face of their communities can practically maintain credible and effective influence over the strategic and performance expectations through the proposals as they stand. On one hand, the government is talking about ensuring that the proposals maintaining influence by district councils and local authorities into the strategic decision-making and the performance expectations of the entities, but the proposals as they stand seems to be falling short of that mechanical, that assurance, how to be achieved. So I think, taking into consideration the proposed by the government, the proposal by the government as it stands at the moment, we see some significant merits, but we also see some significant risks. So how does the government propose at this point in time to give effect to their reforms? Basically, they propose that out of 67 TLAs, there will be an amalgamation forming 4 water services entities, and you can see in front of you on the map there the territorial boundaries of these authorities. When it comes to our particular case, we fall under the embrace or the framework of Entity B. That comprises some 22 territorial local authorities and with a gross population of about 800,000 people. It's a significant degree of change. It's a significant geographical coverage and involves a significant level of challenges, to be taken into consideration. So the next step and the question is that what does the government propose to do in terms of the governance for those entities? And in a nutshell, what the government structure requires is the formation out of 22 territorial local authorities of a regionally representative group comprising 5 representatives of the TLAs and 5 representatives from iwi. And those, that regional representative group will appoint a subgroup, or what we call an independent selection panel to appoint and monitor the entity's governance boards. In turn, the entity board will govern the entity and will require to contain certain competencies. Those competencies are yet to be set in legislation, and they're not supposed to be more than 10 members. The government policy statement will provide direction to entities on the national policy priorities, and that's quite important key because it assumes there will be an overarching government statement onto which the entities will slave to. Instead, there's no mention at this point in time of any reference to the wishes and the expectations of the local, territorial local authorities. It's certainly, the entities, the governance boards of the entities are required to deliver the objectives of the policy statements. The board of the entities will be accountable to the regional representative group. Now, the key element of concern as we go through these proposed reforms centers around the accountability and responsiveness to local community aspirations. If this entity's boards will report to the regional representative group, and their primary mandate is to give effect to the government and policy statement, how do TLAs have an opportunity to influence that decision-making and the priorities? Now, the question also arises as to how representative the regional representative group can be. There are 22 TLAs. We are supposed to appoint and select 5 representatives to sit the regional representative group. Now, the question arises very acutely as to how representative that group will be for each individual TLA's specific needs and specific expectations. So what has the government asked us to do? The government acknowledges, and the Department of Internal Affairs acknowledges, that this is a major change. Each community must have the opportunity to be provided with adequate and clear information to enable them to provide a meaningful input into these proposals. However, we're not at that stage yet. I think it's quite important to note from officers' perspectives that while there is reasonable acceptance on the metrics direction, there is a significant skepticism and risk in those numbers. And you see in my reports that the government has based the benefits of amalgamation on a whole range of metrics. They have identified that over the next 30 years, costs requirements for the three waters will escalate to between $120 and $180 billion. If you take the current investment in three waters by all TLAs into the country, are in the region of about $90 billion a year. Now, there are various assessments and analyses done to those evaluations by the government. I state in my reports, in our report to you, that in broad direction, those cost escalations appear to be pragmatic and expected. However, it is impossible right now to pinpoint accurately whether the cost will be from $90 billion as they are currently to $120 or $180 billion. The modeling used relies heavily on a number of assumptions, which, and again, I've used the expression that a reasonable person can have some second thoughts about it and say, how valid are these assumptions? And I think it is quite important to recognize that. However, our own evaluation and evaluation done by, on behalf of the Department of Internal Affairs itself, it states very clearly the assessment the government has made on the highest cost escalation of $180 billion costs escalations in the future cannot be accurately supported. The direction can be validated broadly, is in that direction, but the numbers cannot be exact. It will only take for us really a gradual escalation of investment in three waters over the next few years to actually come to the $120 billion collectively. So it's not really unreasonable to expect that cost will escalate. However, the total number and the accuracy of that number is still under a significant degree of skepticism by our sector, by our professional people. It is this proposal, it is a major intergenerational change. I personally very well remember the Government Act changes in 1989 that drove a lot of changes to the government. The Transit New Zealand Act in 1991 that drove a lot of changes into the way councils used to deliver their roading services at those times. And a whole range of other legislation and policy statements government has taken place in the late 80s and the 90s. So this is in par with this kind of changes, and therefore I think it's quite important to be a bit cautious about it, take the appropriate steps to seek clarity and better information before we actually go into answering the question, are we in or are we out? A lot of people are asking the question, are we here today considering whether we're in or out of that proposal? And the answer is neither. The answer, we are here to say the information in our hands at the moment, it's simply not sufficient to allow us to make that decision. The government needs to take some feedback from us and from all the TLAs, go away and refine and review their proposals and come back with a refined proposal before we are actually able to go to our communities and say, well, that's a refined proposal. What do you think? Before elected members, you can make these final decisions. That's our view. So just to give, again, remind all of us what we are talking about when we're talking about the three water assets. Obviously, I cannot identify all the assets we've got, but this is just a representative picture. You can see the wastewater treatment plant to the left. That's a Rotuti wastewater treatment plant. To the right, it's a picture of one of our 81 pump stations, and we've got another switch pump station, got another 20-25 water pump stations and sources of water, UV treatments and so on. These are significant chunks of assets that have been invested and created over a number of years, and we continue to improve and modify them through our LTPs and our infrastructure strategy. Again, in summary, you can see here the quantum, the scale of our assets in terms of water supply, wastewater, and our stormwater. And again, these were not created yesterday. They've been created over generations, gradually been integrated, gradually have been improved, gradually have been adjusted to new legislation and new community expectations and requirements. But there are a significant portfolio of our assets, and you can see here in the next PowerPoint is that it's indicative that the replacement value of those assets is about in the order of $900 million. The depreciated replacement cost, or what we call fair value, is about $430 million. Now, again, it is quite important for elected members and the community at large to be cognizant of those, basics, because renewals, when you look into our assets, our indicative state of it is that 50% of our assets are being consumed. So if we're going to replace all our assets tomorrow, for example, we need $900 million. What's the remaining value? The remaining unconsumed portion of our assets, about $430 million. That means about $500 million of assets have been consumed and have not been replaced. We have a renewal profile going forwards, and this council, and I acknowledge that some of you have not been here since 2015, but since 2015, through the LTPs, steps have been taken to reinstate an appropriate forward renewal level for our three water assets that replaces, roughly speaking, about 1.5% of the value of the assets. But looking into the deficiency or the unreplaced portion of the assets for the last 30 or 35 years, about $500 million, there is a legacy of about 30 to 35 years of underinvestment in these assets. Now, our infrastructure strategy, for which you consider and approve every triennium, every 3 years as you go through the LTP, has identified the need to increase in the future the renewals investment required and our operations expenditure. And you can see in the next PowerPoint here too. And again, this is just portions of the infrastructure strategy you have recently approved. In the water supply, in the wastewater and the stormwater, the portion to the left, which calls the percentage of design life expended, that means it's the part of the assets that have been consumed, they have not been replaced. And the pink and the heavy red elements indicate where in the future we need to increase our renewal investments. For example, gravity mains or sewage system needs to, will need to be addressed. The mains in our stormwater system, and obviously elements relating to securing consents for global stormwater resource consents. So because our assets are getting to a midlife of their design life expectancy, their condition also is having has been impacted, and therefore its operations and maintenance component is increasing. If we want to reduce risks for critical failures, then in the future we have to keep increasing our renewal process. And that's where I go back into what I've said. The government, the nation at this point in time is spending about $2.7 billion a year in these three water services. But every TLA recognizes that in the future, in the next 10 years and the next 10 years, we have to continue to increase this expenditure to keep pace with an aging infrastructure and new regulations and new demands. Again, we're talking regularly about our renewals profile. In a rough sense, though, for every dollar we spend in renewals, we spend another $2 on operations and maintenance. So, as our renewal, as our assets age and they become less reliable, we spend more money on operations and maintenance because they break more often, more regularly. And therefore, we need to invest more in our operations and maintenance. And that drives that initial concern of the government to say how sustainable and affordable would be on local communities to continue to invest more money into their three waters assets into the future. And that's what's driving the government concerns. And of course, we share these concerns. And as I said, we have taken steps since 2015 to gradually adjust our LTPs within our fiscal envelopes to address this kind of concerns. So, the idea of scale really, and the benefits that are arriving from scale is to optimize the balance between investment in renewals, investment in growth, and reducing the future operational and maintenance liabilities. Having consideration to the government's draft proposals as they stand at the moment, we've been working across the whole sector to structure a process we call the Council Impact Assessment. And the question really, it's quite simple. It's saying you've got three scenarios in front of you. One scenario is the Council as it is here and now. The second scenario is that how the Council's three water services will be, how they will look like in the next 10 years, because you all have made long-term plan decision making, and you have improved your investment and your approach to three waters, and versus the model. And that was clustered together into some key drivers, such as service standards. Service standards basically ask the question, can you meet drinking water standards? Can you meet all your resource consents, for your sewage? Can you meet, can you meet your potential resource consents for new stormwater, investment? And basically, what this assessment indicates that the Council model, as has been augmented by your long-term plan, by the LTP, fares pretty well against the reforms. We are not at a significant disadvantage compared to the reforms. We can meet these expectations. There is a slight improvement under the reform model because obviously these proposed entities will have a much broader leverage to finance new growth, services, and they can borrow more money and so on. But these are not critical differences. As a council, as we are at the moment, we are facing squarely the risk of private water supplies. We've got a number of water supplies in the district that are not covered by our public system. The regulations are expected that will compel councils to actually take over these private water supplies, and therefore will face the risk of funding, upgrading, and improving these private water supplies. To a large degree, we're not entirely sure what that entails because the regulations from the regulator have not been approved yet. It's subject to government, to the Parliament, procedures under the Water Services Bill, but this is going to be a significant risk. Then you've got funding and finance. I think it's fair to say that as you know that our finance department and you as elected members make constant efforts to balance the needs of financing various activities in the district, ranging from infrastructure to social infrastructure to social services, and so on. You continuously evaluate that balance of investment, and I think we are in a good step at the moment. There might be a small level of improvement under the reform model because at the moment our debt-to-income ratio is about 250%. These entities are proposed to have a debt-to-income ratio between 600 and 800%. So they'll be able to borrow more money than we can borrow under the regulations. The question can be asked, why wouldn't the government allow TLAs to change that debt-to-income ratio too? The government's approach to date is that they don't trust local government to have to achieve efficiencies on their own without amalgamation. The key areas of risk as we see them in terms of this council impact assessment we have identified there is with regards to the hard gains that have been made through the co-governance or partnering arrangements and relationships with iwi over the years, and how we can manage to maintain a viable and a strong community voice into decision making. And you can see the council model is in green. The reform model gives you it's an orange actually, orange yellow, and a very big red into that element on the other side. We believe that the model and the proposal as it stands at the moment leaves very little room for local communities to actually have a meaningful input into the decision making, because as I said earlier, our concern is that you're going to have a regional representative group monitoring the entity's governance board, and the governance board will have one single objective to meet the government policy statements. How do we meet our own local needs? How do we go around and make sure that our multiple objectives can be fulfilled in a meaningful way? And that's a big risk for us. Again, our evaluation highlighted again that our LTP implemented model is broadly green. The reforms can give us a little bit of better leverage in terms of securing better financing for delivering services in the future. How is a big red in terms of community active involvement into the whole process and having a meaningful and loud and a responsive approach to what we need to do. I will let Gina can talk a little bit about our relationships with iwi too. What I would want to say, and I keep telling my colleagues at the national level, is a simple fact that when you go to any community to talk about spatial planning, environmental outcomes, community well-being, community sports and recreation, community land development expectations, we structure our infrastructure and Three Waters infrastructure needs and growth in the context of those wider outcomes. If you're going to have an entity B dealing exclusively with Three Waters and engaging with the local communities, how do you integrate these multiple of outcomes into a utility service? Now, there are two ways to address it. Either the entity B develops its own capability to do that, which is going to be basically duplication of effort, or allows our council, the council, to be the gateway into the communities, and therefore the entity B takes its instructions and direction from the wishes of the local community through its duly elected, democratically represented body of elected members here, instead of listening to a government policy statement. And again, this is just another representation there. It's just a bar chart, but again, services, a slight improvement under the reform model, finance and funding, basically the LTP model and the reform model are not significantly different, other than the fact that the entities can borrow a bit more money than we can. Certainly under social, community and economic well-being, the reforms as they stand at the moment are inferior to our LTP modified council approach. And resourcing, we're not a big entity, we are not a big TLA, we are the 10th biggest TLA into the country. We have a sufficient critical mass to employ, train, and use internal and external resources in a balanced way to achieve what we want to do. So therefore, we don't see a significant gain for us in terms of this, making sure the resourcing is in place. I'll qualify that by saying, by my earlier statement, that whatever happens, the three waters will need to see in the future 10, 20, 30 years increased investment. With that increased investment, you increase your resource allocation. I would like to sort of let you know too that in doing the regional analysis, the approach we have taken in terms of resourcing here, we, for example, employ somewhere in the region about 27 engineering staff internally, and we deliver somewhere in the region of $35 million of three water services a year, plus one-off big projects like the treatment plant and so on. Tapo has half of our expenditures, but they employ twice as many people in their engineering sector. Tauranga has got twice our expenditure, but they've got about 3 or 4 times the number of engineering staff in their units. It's an indication for us that I think the mix we have adopted using the sector, using partnerships, using collaborative approaches, using performance-specified maintenance contracts and so on, it allows us the degree of luxury to play around with our internal resources. And that's why we're coming to the level we say the reforms don't offer to us a significant carrot at this point in time in terms of resource. I think it's quite important for Gina to explore a little bit about the impact on, especially of our relationship with iwi, and how the reforms appear to be impacting onto those relationships in a way that potentially will be detrimental to the achievements made in recent years. Gina?
Tēnā tātou ia rangatira. I thought that what I might do is, if we can go back to slide 9, which is a photo of the Rotuti Wastewater Treatment Plant, I thought I would illustrate the complexity of these issues for mana whenua. I don't usually get any complaints that I'm too quiet. So what you're looking at here is the Rotuti Wastewater Treatment Plant, and I want to illustrate the layers of interest that arise when we talk about infrastructure assets. So in 2012, this council failed to achieve resource consent in the Environment Court. That was millions of dollars of expense that failed because of inadequate relationships with mana whenua. That was 9 years ago, and we're now at a point where we have a treatment plant that has been built and is connecting homes through the Rotuti area. The Crown, in dealing with the proposed reforms, has identified that it needs to engage with iwi and with mana whenua, but it is talking to primarily the top layer, is what I would say. It would be like talking to the regional council about district council affairs. That's the analogy, and I want to give an illustration. So if you look at this treatment plant, it is built on land owned by, privately owned land, owned by Māori landowners. They are not iwi. So they are not part of the discussion with the Crown. The network of pipes that connects homes with the plant crosses multiple areas of Māori land, all owned by different private people, Māori landowners. They are not involved in the discussions with the Crown. They are not iwi. If you look down the hill, there is a marae there. There is also an urupa, a cemetery. They are affected by traffic, noise, landscape effects, a whole range of implications and environmental effects that arise from having a treatment plant next door. They are not iwi. They are not involved in the discussions directly with the Crown. If you look a little further out, you can see the lake, which of course has been a long time taonga of the Te Aroha Lakes Trust on behalf of Te Aroha and Ngāti Pikiao. And fortunately, Te Aroha Lakes Trust are engaged in the process. But what I'm trying to illustrate here is that the Crown is is appropriately talking to those groups with interests in water. They have not recognised yet the complexity of dealing with landowners. At Council, as the managers and operators of infrastructure assets, we don't have that luxury. We have to work with all of those different landowner groups. We have to work with the marae. We have to work with hapu. That is crucial in order to get these projects actually operational. The days when we simply went into people's land against their consent have changed. That's not the legal context that we live in now, and councils and the Crown have come to realise that. The complexity of these issues requires operational relationships on a day-to-day basis with multiple groups. And the concern that we have, if we can go back to the slide that we were on, which I think is slide... go back to one more.
Are you driving?
The concern we have is that while the engagement with mana whenua has started, which is an improvement, when we last reported to you, there was still, that was very much in its infancy. There is now much more engagement with iwi, with the Crown. But there has been a failure to recognise the complexity of day-to-day operational relationships that are crucial to the successful operation of infrastructure assets. So what that means in terms of the reforms is you will see we've given it an orange, which means worse than the current status quo. It's not a red because there has been a recognition that there needs to be engagement with mana whenua, and there is some provision for mana whenua in the process sitting alongside Council in terms of the structure that Stavros has outlined. But where we are highly concerned is the lack of detail around how operational relationships will be maintained. And the concern we have is, yes, Entity B could replicate that. It would be extraordinarily expensive. They would be starting from scratch, and we think it would fatally affect the costings and the assumed savings provision that have been built into the reform proposal. We have outlined these concerns with officials, DIA, through the workshops and direct discussions. I don't have yet confidence that the detail of the proposal supports addressing these concerns. I would say, though, that all of the concerns that we are raising are things that could potentially be addressed. We simply do not have the detail from the Crown at this stage to form a final view on whether it is positive or negative.
Just to reinforce a couple of points, and again, I'm saying that because I do come in contact with people on a daily basis asking me some simple questions. In Rotorua, we do have some unique characteristics too. A significant chunk of our Three Waters infrastructure is residing on iwi land, on mana whenua land. there are historical agreements and gifting and reserves and so on. But the reality, if these relationships are not managed effectively, it could potentially affect and significantly impact on the future cost and the viability of this, of these kind of services. Some people ask, well, this is public land. Well, it's not really. If you need to go to a private property and you seek to achieve an easement with a sewage pipe, through that property, you generally have to enter into a legal agreement with a private property owner, and there are trade-offs, there are exchanges of how you achieved it. So when you're siting your sewage treatment plants, onto EU land, your water reservoirs, your pump stations, your discharge points, and so on, onto EU land that's been gifted and treated as, particular reserves, then it becomes very pivotal that the relationship between the service manager and the landowner, is as effective as possible. We're not satisfied at this point in time in that the proposals taking that into consideration in a meaningful way or in a pragmatic way. And as Gina said, if they're going to replicate it, that is going to be a waste of resource, basically, and with very doubtful outcomes to be achieved. I know this is taking a bit long, but I think it is important. That, so I suppose in terms of asking the question, where do we see, having considered all these elements, where do we see alignment in these proposals? We have to, we acknowledge that we accept that scale can offset some of those identified future risks. And again, it remains for debate, the accuracy of that scale benefits, but the trends, are certainly not debatable, by us, because we can see this kind of, benefits. That will come through rationalization, harmonization of plans and standards. Obviously, there will be, better leverage, for borrowing money to invest in growth, investment. For a young professional engineer, in their 30s, they will see a lot more, career development paths into a larger, company than in a council perspective, and obviously an improved risk focus. So there are some key concerns we have significant reservations about, and again, the primary concern here is the loss of identity and local voice without an adequate leverage. Remember, NTDB will encompass a population of about 800,000 people versus our 70,000 people local population. It's quite easy to say there will be influence. But when you get involved into the clutter and the chatter of a bigger environment of 800,000 people, how much priority our local aspirations and requirements would take over larger, population centers. And that's a big concern for us. And I think that drives us, to have some concerns, whereas Gina said, when you go and approach our local communities, whether it's Tarawera, whether it's Rotuti, Rotoma, whether it's Ngatirangi Waiwehi or Glenhorn or Utuhina, or and we make local decisions on the basis of the background and design solutions to suit a particular sort of environments, will we have the ability to do that, or there will be a significant disconnection between our future city planning and our infrastructure planning, and then we'll suffer the consequences of that. So the key issues that the government proposal that forms our current position is that, as I said, we recognize that, we recognize the rationale of the Three Waters proposed reforms, we recognize the concerns, and we have taken significant steps to collaborate and work with our colleagues at the technical level, at the Department of Internal Affairs level, to help navigate, as far as possible those proposals. However, I think a strong suggestion, a recommendation we make to you as our governance board is that the Rotorua Lakes Council must strongly preserve the role of locally elected leadership and decision-making and align that with Three Waters objectives instead of being taken over by a larger entity without that opportunity to have a strong influence into that. So, what we would like to see to change our view, obviously we want to make sure that our local Three Water strategy, which is structured through your approval and through our partnering agreement with iwi, should guide the inputs and activities of the three water centres or districts. We have to make sure the council, be assured the council receives services are not inferior to what we can achieve on our own. If anything, they should be demonstrably better than what we've got at the moment. And this council should be the podium or the platform or the avenue through which the proposed entity reports performance against our own strategic outcomes and objectives. We think that simply a proposed entity reporting performance against a government policy statement is really too nebulous to give you assurance that you will be able to pursue your strategic objectives as you see them and in your capacity as representing the local community. And I think that's it. Apologies, it's taken a bit long, but we're happy to respond to any questions elected members that may have, Your Worship. Thank you.
Just thank you for that presentation, both of you. And Stavros, at some stage it may come out as a question, but we've also been trying to work constructively with what could be a proposed solution, which is in the preliminary paper, which you've all got. So we'll open up for questions now. Councillor Yates.
Tēnā koe, and through you, Madam Chair, nei rā te mihi kia kōrua hakua te takaroa o tērā kauhau I tutuki ngā kōrero e hāpai nei I a tātou. So just wanted to congratulate you both, and although it might have been long, Stavros, it's really well informed. I do have the question, and the question is around, whilst we've got 800,000 identified as a population base within Entity B, do we know how many iwi are constituted in that particular entity? Because even if we just look at Tarawa itself, there is a large number, and I'm mindful of that, and I ask that question because that would, Entity B would also have the largest Māori population and potentially the largest Māori ownership population in that too.
I would hesitate to seek to define who are iwi within that area. What I would say is that there is no clarity in the proposals on who that is referring to. At present, there is sometimes a reference to mana whenua and sometimes a reference to iwi, and it is unclear how that is being defined.
Councillor Rotuti. Question.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for taking the time, Stavros, because it's something we have to get our head around, and it's a very good summary of the position that we see ourselves confronted with. My question is, the asset summary that you've put together for us here, are the others in B, are they doing that exercise now themselves, and so
yes.
that you get an idea of what actually the total is for B?
Yes, Councillor Tait. Yeah, every TLA is doing the council impact assessment, and to the best of my knowledge, the broad picture you see here, give or take some variation to the percentages. Really, it's a picture that is a national, it's a national picture. We're not really sort of an island, in the ocean. We are we're an island amongst many islands, and I think that the picture is pretty similar.
Is that an issue that comes up in the technical working group, Stavros, that you've been on with DIA?
Yes, it does, Your Worship. And I think one of the things that, sometimes it's difficult for the, the general public to appreciate is that, is the challenges of a design, distinguish between the design life of an asset and the need to replace an asset. Often, people say, well, we have invested in these assets 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, we have to reinvest again. The reality is that you replace and you upgrade assets, for two reasons: because they reach the end of their useful life, they collapse, physically they collapse. But more often, you replace assets because they're no longer able to do what they intended to do. You need more capacity, you need bigger pipes because a bigger population, you've got new environmental standards, you need to treat wastewater at a higher level. And again, I will remind us, our community here too, it was only in the 80s where our treatment plant was basically a primary treatment facility. Or sewage was going there, was milli screened and dumped into the lake. Maybe, or maybe a bit earlier than that, okay? Well, in the next 5 years, we're going to have a wastewater treatment plant that produces an effluent, that is just a notch below drinking water standards. So, when you look into these technical challenges, it's not just about the age and the investment required now. The question, what is going to be required because of new regulations, new standards, new community expectations to be achieved?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Stavros and Gina, for the report. Just one question is how we see the position of Infracore, because I didn't see in the paper that we'd specifically mentioned the ability that we have within our own community to have, we're currently providing wastewater services, we are providing training. What's the opportunity or the pros and cons in terms of the Three Waters reform with Infracore in the picture for us?
Councillor Kaifong, I think it'd be fair to say that the government proposals actually have not turned their mind to the detail of service delivery. When they're talking about Three Waters delivery, they mean people like myself, taking the engineers out of the council and put them together under a new roof. Service delivery, it's all these hundreds and thousands of people who dig trenches and replace pipes and provide sort of, the muscle, behind doing all that work. I think on the face of it, the statement or proposal by the government indicates that there will be an emphasis in promoting and encouraging local employment growth and local opportunities. However, you've got to balance that against the stated benefits of scale and efficiencies to be achieved. For them to achieve the stated 60% efficiency gains, as over 30 years, it means that they have to achieve consistently 2% efficiency gains over and above the CCPI you apply every year. So therefore, they will go for scale service delivery in order to achieve this kind of efficiency. So we don't have the detail. And again, that's another element when we say that we want to have an input in and a question, how would those proposed entities, activities, engineer, encourage and promote local economic benefits at the region, including the Infracore types of activities.
Thank you.
And supplementary to that is the formation of Trility. Is that an entity that could sit and be scaled up, in your view?
Trility is it's a model. Trility is a consortium of engineering expertise, service delivery like Fulton Hogan, and design expertise like Stontech. Okay, so in the future, you would see that to be a scaled up model, because if you are an entity B and you want to minimize your logistics, networks, you will need to engage with large entities, large consortiums, to be able to deliver all these kind of services. So the opportunities to be absorbed and collaboration at a larger level.
Yes, thank you very much. Through you, Mayor, through you, Chair, I'm very interested in the extent to which the analysis, and it's a comprehensive, sophisticated analysis, and I really appreciate the work that's gone into it by both of you. And it's interesting to me that councils elsewhere that were given August and September to advise the government of local issues of local concern, they came up with similar sorts of concerns. That is, they cited potentially adverse economic effects. They have some distrust of the economies of scale arguments. You talked about a healthy scepticism by reasonable people. I agree. And in particular, the inevitable errors that accompany trying to do 30-year projections of the entities. And so my question goes straight to the heart of the nature of this analysis and the pillars that it stands on. So my first question is that to what extent are the recommendations of the Co-Governance Committee embedded in this analysis?
We've had an initial meeting, but the committee hasn't been formally formed yet, and we're yet to have the formal appointments from Te Aroha. What I would say, though, is that we have continued to engage directly with the groups that are directly affected by this. So, for example, the trustees of Te Puna Pekehaua, which of course owns the land underlying what was formerly called Taniwha Springs and supplies water to the western side of the city. We've continued to engage with essentially all of the organisations that are directly affected. The sense that we are getting from our mana whenua partners is first a concern that these proposals are occurring without the Crown resolving what is called rights and interests. So Māori have for a long time asserted rights and interests in freshwater, including rights akin to ownership. Those have been recognised by the Supreme Court and referred to by the government at the time in court in evidence. Those issues haven't been resolved, so there's a great deal of concern about the impact of the reforms on those issues. They're raising those issues directly with the Crown. That's not something really for Council to be leading. The other issue is, like us, a concern that there is a lack of detail on which to assess and analyse. There's conceptual discussion about how councils and iwi will collectively appoint members to the representation group and so forth, but it's very unclear how that will actually happen, who's in the tent, who's allowed to participate in that, how will that actually, what are the mechanics for that to occur. So I think, like us, iwi are concerned at the lack of detail.
Thank you. I appreciate that, the answer. And my second question that follows from that is, councils had unsolicited comments received from many members of the wider public since the 1st of August, and I wondered if we can be provided with a summary of that feedback.
Could you just clarify, Councillor McPherson, do you want a summary of all of the questions to Council from the wider community, or our feedback to the community? Just
no, I
clarify.
specified how many and what's the nature of the unsolicited submissions to Council. Very aware of, because I've been copied many of them by residents and ratepayers, they have profound concerns about Three Waters, and many of these concerns have been captured in the analysis that we've had this morning. And I wondered if the analysis has been done of those unsolicited submissions so that we can appreciate the nature of that feedback. Thank you.
I'll try to give a view about that, Councillor McPherson, and I think that's my view, and as an officer, rather than the elected member of the council. But I think at an informal level and through emails and through letters, there is a significant number of correspondence by people saying that those proposals by the government as stand at the moment, they need to be treated very cautiously because, a great number of reasons. One of the reasons, for example, is the notion that our assets will be gifted, to some other entity. Okay, and I have tried to explain in this report here too that there is our assets are not tradable assets. They're not something you can sell in the market. They just got a notional value, and they don't leverage income on the basis of the value of the assets. We leverage income on the basis of the service those assets, provides. Other elements with regards to the participation or the composition of the governance structure of these entities, the regional representative group, the 50-50 TLAs, 50% and AUE. And again, I think we try to reflect in our report to you here today is that we feel that kind of structure of governance is not going to be truly representative of the local, of the local communities. So, to broad level, we agree with that, with this kind of, of sediments. But we have not made any effort actually to tabulate, all the themes of the, of the feedback and information we had. However, I strongly suggest and I would fully expect that once the government receives this feedback from us, they will come with a refined proposal, and then we really have to go to the community and engage in the special consultation process through which we get all the feedback and all the approaches that are required for you or are necessary for you to make a final decision. Because at this point in time, my estimate, judging by what I have seen today, is that what we're saying here today is not inconsistent with the vast majority of the feedback we had from people. It's about identification, ability to influence, ability to bear costs, all these, all these elements there too. And we're telling the government their proposal as it stands at the moment needs refinement before we can go to the community and engage in the special consultation process. But if the elected members want us to collate all that emails and all the information and come with a theme, we can do that, but it's up to you.
Members are unable to instruct an officer to put forward a collated view of letters that have come in through various channels. We note them, we can note them. Do you have any more questions, Councillor McPherson?
Yes. With regard to that, another facet of the building of this position that's been put in front of us is the consultations at Entity B working group level. And I wonder if, Your Worship, you're prepared to give us an update on the position that you took, which was a unilateral position. And that obviously was part of the background to this position being developed. I wonder if you'd care to update us on that set of decisions that you made on our behalf.
Well, no, this is the time for questions. When we open for discussion, I'll certainly share the role that, a little bit of the role that I've been attempting to undertake. But this is time for questions for clarification through to the officers. Yes,
thank you. That's.
I will speak to it when I get a chance to speak.
I'm delighted. I look forward to that.
I'll share it, what I can.
Now, the rest of my concerns are the actual substance of the proposal, and they are not, I don't need technical clarification on those, so I'll leave it at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And it is an iterative process, and it is an ever-changing process as well. Any other questions? I've got Councillor Donaldson, Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. Just this notion of ownership seems to be at the heart of some of the unsolicited emails we've been getting on this issue, Stavros, and it includes emails to the effect that I've been a ratepayer here for 50, 70, whatever years and paid for these assets, and now you can't give them away. But I think my personal view, and I have a question.
Ask a question.
Yeah. So my question is, what percentage? And I was here on council when Helen Clark came and handed over a substantial putia on behalf of the government or the taxpayer to address sewerage schemes in four priority lakes. There is continued government investment committed into our Three Waters infrastructure to deal with our housing growth. So ballpark, in your knowledge of recent history, perhaps going back to about 2012, what has been the level of central government investment alongside the ratepayer into the assets that, because I think it's a red herring sort of feature of the discussion myself.
Direct response to your question, to the best of my, and again, on the hope, not knowledge, you have about, the council receives somewhere in the region about $40 million of government crown funding for the sewage reticulation systems. In recent times, we got 15 and 9, about another 22. That's $62 million, from the government for the CIP project to the east and the Three Waters better off, investment. And there are subsidies from the MFU for like the Tarawera, another $6.5 million. So I would imagine sort of the high level, probably the government contributed somewhere in the region of about $100 million in the creation of new assets, over the last 10 years or so. The total replacement value of our assets is about $900 million, as you see, in our structure there too. But again, it's a complex issue where people just think that because you have created an asset, then that's it. That asset becomes an ongoing liability in terms of constant renewal and constant maintenance and operation of schemes from there too. And I had a conversation yesterday with an individual which, along the lines, we said, well, if the current value of our asset is $400 million, why shouldn't this entity buy it from us? Well, the natural consequence of that, of course, is that those entities, they're going to have to recover that revenue somehow, and they would charge it through a targeted rate or a volumetric rate, or or charge or somehow, or borrow it. They will charge it to the user again. So basically, if the entity paid this district $400 million of depreciated value of their assets, and they were liable for $900 million of replacement of assets, then they will charge it somehow. So the same, they will give with one hand and take with another hand. So, it makes no sense to me, but some people got that view.
If I might add to that answer, one of the things to consider is that this is why we are saying that the ongoing provision of service must be at least the standard that we receive today. The assets are not just important for their financial value, they are primarily important because of the environmental impacts that they manage and the human health and well-being outcomes that they deliver. It's what they do that is important. And if we were to transfer the assets and not have clarity that the level of outcomes and services will be at least the same, then there would be an issue. And we've identified that in our analysis.
And there is that provision that there will be no privatisation of the entities.
Councillor Kumar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And through the Chair, thank you, Gina and Stavros, for a very detailed presentation and some understanding on the pros and cons of what I believe is probably bigger than Ben-Hur or bigger than anything that I've ever seen in the council come when where the whole country is concerned. So from the first workshops to now, my question is, based on the report, on balance, is the council ever going to tell us a position on what it favours, or are we going to wait for a full public consultation before the council decides what they favour?
I think, Councillor Kumar, what we are saying at this point in time is that we know the government's proposals. We have a certain degree of sympathy to the benefits of scale, but we have significant concerns about the elements of local representation. And therefore, we cannot state whether we support the proposals. We don't support the proposals as they are at the moment as a council, but we cannot at this point in time go to our community and say, well, we want a final decision, whether to enter this arrangement or not, because the government have not asked us to do that. They have asked us only to give them feedback. Once we get that we give that feedback, and the feedback is as outlined. There, we need to see significant improvements in how they will address these proposals. Then then we will have a, I would imagine you as elected members, you will want to consult with your community and before you form a final decision, sir.
Thank you, Stavros. And once again, through the chair, the reason for me asking this question is because the level of engagement, the emails, and what the council have been engaged is far more engaged and thorough than what we will ever receive in information. So we will expect to get a bit of a guideline as to where the general consensus is going.
Noted. Councillor Tapsell.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. Thank you very much for this presentation. It's really important that elected members, but also the community, understand that background information, because the decisions that we make now in the next 10 years are going to affect the next 100 years. So it's hugely significant intergenerationally in how we look after our assets. One of the key concerns that I had, and this is where my question comes in, is the reform may deliver better service, but as you've mentioned, the social, community and economic well-being will be less with reform. So you get better service, but potentially worse indicators for well-being. So one of the most important things that council potentially could have influence over is setting some key performance indicators to ensure that any changes through these reforms will continue to meet our local needs and expectations. So will there be an opportunity in future, either through the co-governance group or through the feedback to government, where we could signal that we would like to be able to set our own key performance indicators if they are to look after the service of our water assets?
Yes, Councillor Tapsell, I think that our report basically that's what it says, you know, that these entities need to be able to demonstrate adherence or compliance with the service expectations or performance expectations that we define through our three-water strategy. And how we arrive at our three-water strategy is through the collaboration with iwi and our communities, you know, to make sure that we've got a consensus of what those expectations are.
And that's outlined in our preliminary paper. Do you want to speak to that?
Through the chair. Look, I think if you go to page 26 of the attachment on the preliminary position, you'll see that the ensuring the entities deliver to community outcomes, the concept, the solution that's been outlined there is actually accurately as per what you've actually put forward.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Stavros, and thank you, Gina. It's been really enlightening to see the information provided today, and also through LGNZ for our young elected members as well. The question that I had was around, there's a bit of concern and a bit of uncertainty with private supplies, tank water, whether or not they get their water from natural springs, rural water supplies, and what the reforms could bring onto them, whether that be more testing, treatment, incredibly important things. But on a local level for us, how is that going to impact, or how can we have a bit of say to kind of work together to mitigate some of those impacts?
Thank you, Councillor Wong. As I said earlier, the specific expectations by the central regulator are yet to be announced, because that's subject matter of the Water Services Bill that the government is promoting or pushing through the Parliament. If you ask my opinion, at a professional level, you will find my view is that these private supplies, whether it's in the urban area or in rural areas, they have to demonstrate compliance with a set of health conditions. The outcome is going to be that those private suppliers will not have the competence and the capability to do it themselves, and by necessity they will be shifted under the council stewardship. And that's why we highlighted that we have a risk under our current council model that the regulation will force these private suppliers to come under the council umbrella, and that will require some significant investment to bring it up to the standards as our other 9 suppliers we have, and we fully comply with our drinking water standards. But to bring it up to that level and steward them appropriately under the regulation probably will become our responsibility as a TLA.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Tēnā kōrua. Thank you, Stavros and Gina, for a very thorough report here. I was very interested in the way you looked at, and before asking my question, on page 17, right at the bottom there, number 4, embedding cultural values into the way we manage our infrastructure. The question I've got there is just there when you had the implications. Legislation is requiring that iwi have a greater role in the governance or decision making for key assets. I'm wondering that in another future report or something, if we could have, say, a one-pager of the legislation. I know that it comes thick, but just so that it helps us answer some of the unsolicited letters we tend to get, so we can point out things like, this is legislation.
Thank you, Madam Mayor, sorry. Stavros, do you believe in your heart of hearts that this decision isn't worthy of a nationwide referendum rather than being decided by a dozen folk around a table?
I'll rule on that, Councillor Bentley, and the council officer cannot speak for a political decision of central government. Yes.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Perhaps you can answer it then.
No, I'm not answering it. I'm not in central government. Would you like to speak to that?
Yes, through the chair. I think it's important to note that the decision that you're making today is not a decision around this reform process. It is simply a decision as to the nature of feedback that you are providing to government on the proposal as it has been received to date. You're not making a decision today with respect to the direction of this reform process. That is not something that will occur until we've actually got a clear proposal from government. And in fact, what my understanding is that government will do from here on in is to take the feedback that they will receive from councils across the country. They will consider that and make a decision as to how to proceed. That could be a detailed proposal back to councils as to what it is that is actually now being proposed, and it will be on that you'll make a decision about how and whether or not consultation is required. So you're not at that step at the moment. I think it's important just to consider that this is a feedback step and not a decision step at this stage. And indeed, we won't know what the nature of the decision step is until government has actually made that and defined it.
Sorry, a point of clarification, if I might, in the light of the Chief Executive's helpful comments. The decision before us today, the final part of it, is that we're going to endorse this position. That constitutes a difficulty because that requires us to endorse what's in front of us, and there is so much unknown. And with regard to the known unknowns, as it were, is that has there been any advice, technical advice given from council level with regard to alternative structures that could be far more effective in dealing with the challenges? One of the subtleties, of course, is we've got a highly elaborate local position, and I acknowledge the colossal work that's gone into that. That's got to be reconciled with regional subtleties, because a lot of the powers are proposed to move to regional level. And in addition to that, we've got a lot of national subtleties to be taken into account. Then we've got the scientifically determined
So
standards.
what is your question?
So my question is, have we provided advice on what might be a more appropriate structure, at systemic level, a system structure? Thank you.
Through the chair, look, I think what I would sort of ask you to look to is that the government has actually put on the table a proposal, and what they're asking is feedback on that proposal as they've outlined it to date. The proposal is actually looking at highlighting a range of challenges that the government actually sees, and that those challenges have been outlined to you in the report today. The position that has actually been outlined equally is looking at taking those challenges, highlighting where there are points of agreement and points of alignment, if you like. It then goes further and identifies areas of concern, areas that have not been adequately addressed in the model so far. What government comes back with could be a completely different proposal again, but what we've got at the moment is a set of an outline to you as to what staff consider to be the points of agreement and the points of disagreement. That's effectively the feedback that you'll be looking to consider today, or are considering today, I should say.
Thank you. Happy to move? Thank you. Seconder, Councillor Maxwell. All those in favour? Oh no, we're not yet. Mover and seconder. So do you wish to speak to this?
Just briefly, Your Worship, because I think great round of questions and answers, and an excellent presentation, as other members have attested. A tautoko, the risk assessment that was done, that I wish we had a copy of. I didn't see that, the coloured risk assessment, but Gina's outlined one excellent example with the Rotuti wastewater treatment plant, but there are a number of others that are clearly examples that are clearly underway at present that this council needs to be quite reassured that iwi input is and cultural values are embraced. So the key word for me in this recommendation is this is a preliminary position. So the word preliminary is key. We're not making any binding decisions. We're just alerting the government in terms of feedback to the concerns we have. But, you know, we have C&I owned land where we have two water supplies surrounded by land that's owned by C&I, and currently we're thrusting massive blue pipes all through that land to bring that potable water to our community. Is just one example, along with the, as Stavros has talked about, the undergoing work for an appropriate or consent for an appropriate discharge of our treated wastewater from our upgraded plant. So that is a key risk that we need to highlight in this paper, and I think that has been done. I'm happy with that. The other thing that we need, of course, is that local input into, and I think Councillor Tapsell raised a set of KPIs. We need our assets to remain fit for purpose for the health and well-being of our community, but also to address our aspirations for growth in the housing crisis that we're facing right now. So I think all of those have been addressed in our preliminary position, and I'm happy to support the paper. Thank you, Your Worship.
Anybody else wish to speak? I've got Councillor Rokawa Tate.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Look, I think this is a biggie. This is a biggie, and I do feel sometimes that the government does us a great disservice by putting out little information and then being quite selective in asking for feedback. The only feedback the government is getting is from the TLAs and from iwi. And there are concerned people out there. I mean, we're going to put our views other TLAs are putting their views, iwi are putting their views, and then we're going to get the government, as you've just said, Your Worship, is going to look at it and then, put something out again. And yet there could have been some very good assistance given to the government in this initial stage. And I'm thinking actually about the farming community. They could have had some great input into the initial feedback given to the government. So I just feel, and that's the issue that we're seeing from the people in our community who are quite concerned. Like most of us, we've got no idea, they've got no idea. They think we've taken a position, which we haven't. We don't particularly know what's going on with the government. And only two groups, TLAs, well, significant obviously, and iwi. And so that to me is quite unfair. And that's what's concerning our community. If you see what's coming through in terms of emails and contacts and everything that they're getting through to us. So I just feel that, as I said before, sometimes the government sets us up to be under attack by our own community instead of perhaps taking a better approach. And I feel quite strongly on this, but I'm pleased that it's not going to come down today where we're taking a definite position. We're just going to say to the government, you've got gaps. You've got gaps and we are concerned. But I just feel that what comes back to us in a couple of months or in a month is just going to be the views of TLAs and iwi. And I would have liked to have thought when you're building up a case to go to the community, there's more voices coming through in that paper that's going to go out for consultation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, I think where the community is concerned is because, like it's been mentioned, that there's not enough information out there. Plus, they have seen in the past many major government acquisitions fail. Kiwi Rail is a good example. The communication sector is another good example. So there's a fear that if the government does take over this, they could, in the end up not controlling it or looking after it, as well as how local bodies are and how privatization does this. I think that's what the main concerns are. And once the public sort of get to know exactly where it lies, it'll probably allay some of the fears.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I seconded the motion, and I know that this Three Waters reform is huge, and really this is early days, and I said earlier that I was really pleased with the report provided for us. It's given us a bit of a heads up, and I know also that you've indicated that there's still some questions you want to ask, and and that's good. Let's get the answers back from what we want to know. I do want to indicate that this weekend, Te Rangi, where we're here, interested in what's happening here, we're meeting at the marae, and I'd like to be able to go there being positive and saying, well, we at Council have a preliminary position and this is where we're going, and we've still got lots of questions to ask, but I too want to be go there with a positive attitude and a position as well. So happy to support the motion that's there in front of us. Kia ora.
Your Worship, it's now a good time for you to clarify the position you took with the mayors. I'll await your. Thank you.
And allow you all to speak, but yes, I am involved in a working group. Well, I'm not now, but if I give you the position that has been consistently presented to us, and it follows on from the workshops that we had as councillors and also at committee when we developed our preliminary position. You remember bottom lines, we called it. These were our bottom lines that we felt were important, and to continue the work that Stavros was doing with the technical working group, Gina with iwi and mana whenua, and trying to put together really where we are at. So it's been an iterative process, and I think it did begin also with Trinity, where we did have to consult with our community, and we learnt then that there is another model that could work. So your discussion about other models is a really good one. And so we then looked at the establishment of the Co-Governance Committee, and I'm very pleased at your report, Gina, that you've had the discussions that have framed that view that helped us, and also today seeing your impact assessment, which is very specific and becoming much more targeted, that helps us inform our position. You will recall that following a hui and taupo, there was the recommendation to set up a working party. And we're not elected onto that working party. So 22 councils, some mayors and CEOs. And that was to try to see, could we get a position from entity B? And we had a meeting yesterday. And the concerns that I expressed were just as I've heard from you all this morning, actually, that local voice and community matters. And so localism, and that is our preferred position, that the Crown and DIA continue to work with Rotorua Lakes Council to sort through the gaps in which you've had identified with you today. I held out on that and don't believe that a regional entity can come to a consensus view about what is an acceptable way forward. We're all so different, such varied responses, but there is another process that we've set up that I won't speak to today, but I wanted to share with you this morning before I decide where we're going in future, Rotorua Lakes Council. Did we have general consensus amongst our elected members in a public forum about our preliminary position? I am very comfortable with it. I'm very comfortable with it at this stage. I'm also heartened to hear some of the concerns that you've raised. They reinforce that there's gaps and we've got a lot more detail that we have to work through. And when you look at 4 in the resolution, this is a preliminary position arrived at by us, elected members, also informed by the Lakes Board, the Community Board, and Te Tata o Te Arawa, and those other landowner interests that Gina has mentioned this morning. So it's only a preliminary position. That was what I discussed yesterday, that we believe locally that we want to sort out our own way forward. And there may be, in the future, the way that we have to work will change around us. Definitely, the concerns are also highlighted about other legislation, the RMA reforms, the drinking water standards and the regulator that is set up there, and the Act's still to go before the House, which we've got to see, and also the future of local government. And if you remember our position on the future of local government, it is that localism and our community really matters. And if we then say we're going to abrogate that and actually look at a consensus view, I don't think we're doing our community interests the best at a regional fora. But we'll continue to engage where appropriate, and so I'm very supportive of this morning, but I was very concerned about the 2 issues, and I think you've all raised them. We haven't yet consulted with our community, other than in our long-term plan and our infrastructure strategy, which we were very clear about, and the investment that Stavros has outlined this morning, and other than the spatial planning that informs our district plan. So the waters, the 3 waters, certainly come into those position papers that have built up to this today. This preliminary position will be shared, and obviously it's on the public record. And I absolutely agree, I think it was you, Councillor Kumar, that we need things brought back to us. You know, as it changes, we need to bring back to Council what do you feel about this? What's our position on this? So that is the way forward that I see, and we've said in the conclusion our clear intention is to be supportive and constructive in the effort towards a viable and sustainable Three Waters management framework, and we hope our position paper contributes to the further development of any reform processes. So that was really the position that I advocated very strongly at a regional fora yesterday.
Now, I take it, Your Worship, in a discussion phase prior to voting.
Pardon?
We're now in a discussion phase prior to voting.
That's what we're all doing.
Good. I just wanted to be sure about the status, where we are in the argument, in the discussions.
Well done.
My views are slightly different in some areas, though they endorse many parts of the preliminary position. Quite clearly, the government, if government's to achieve its wellbeing purposes, it needs to be party to appropriate investment and to improving the productivity of service delivery. Because it's pretty clear the department, the DIA, has demonstrated that having councils having sole charge of investment and service delivery, that system is not as effective as it should be. But failure is not a ground for taking local government out of the equation completely. It's simply that the system is flawed, and we need a new system which is going to integrate priority setting at 3 different levels in a fairly responsible and systematic way. It's fairly clear from the unsolicited feedback, which I do wish we had before us, that there is a profound degree of concern over ownership and over the governance of the entities, and in particular the 50-50 co-governance model, which is presumed both at this level and by the Minister at entity level. That causes a great deal of disquiet. There's also a great deal of concern, as has been pointed out, that the local influence over quality, investment and management will all be lost, as will local accountability. Entity B will become the sole provider in the area, and citizens will have no option but to pay whatever they charge, and they can't vote them out of office because they won't be elected, and there'll be limited opportunities for feedback. It's almost the equivalent of taxation without representation, which started the American War of Independence. So I advise against the direction that's been taken. The direction that's been proposed by the Minister in structural terms. Many parts of it I agree with, but I don't think it's the smartest structure we could invent to solve the problems before us. There is a big concern I've got towards the end of the statement, attachment 1. It puts up an argument for a joint committee act, and I quote, as a forum for governance oversight. Now the terms are quite precise. The term governance implies the legitimate power to make policy. Oversight means supervision. Therefore, governance oversight means the supervision of governance, and in practical effect, this proposed joint committee would supervise Council's policy making. And this arrangement, such an arrangement, would override the same citizens' rights, the guaranteed to all of us citizens by the LGA, our Bill of Rights, and indeed Article 3 of the treaty. That part of this proposal is utterly unacceptable. The other point is that this proposed joint committee solution at both local level and at regional level, at entity level rather, is partially irrelevant to the main challenge that we're facing. Clearly we need, with regard to the Three Waters, fresh governance structures, fresh management and fresh accountability structures to deliver the Three Waters with quality. Obviously there needs to be a national regulator that uses science to prepare and improve standards and rules for providers to use. So I think a structural solution is still to be developed by the Minister and her advisors, And
when we are speaking, we're not meant to be reading speech notes, which you clearly are.
I'm taking key concepts, and if you care to note, I have little boxes and some phrases underlined.
Right,
I'm picking up on those now. And I note that I'm the only person that once again gets chivied for arguing in a way that runs counter to the prevailing wisdom.
Point of order. We're not being chivied. There is a standing order about speaking and process for speaking, and we don't use speech notes. We all scribble stuff down and grab things. So you're not being chivied, Councillor McPherson. You're raising some very interesting points.
Thank you. I was within seconds of finishing, so you'll be relieved to hear. The key difficulty I've got with the recommendations in front of us is the last line under number 5, the council endorses. I don't think we're anywhere near in a position to be able to endorse this attached preliminary position. If it said something like the council advances the attached preliminary position or advises the preliminary thoughts in the attached position paper, then that would be acceptable to me. But without a sophisticated, careful analysis of the unsolicited feedback from our citizens, I don't think it'd be wise for us to declare that we endorse this position paper. Thank you all for listening so carefully.
Mover of the motion, do you wish to speak, Councillor?
Thank you, Worship. Well, it is a preliminary position paper. Just addressing the last comments from Councillor McPherson in respect of item 5 of the motion. It is a preliminary position paper on a proposal that is yet to be firmed up by the government. So nothing is set in stone, and so we can be pedantic about words like endorses or advances, but I'm very comfortable with the motion as it stands. And I remain in support. I do note at part 3 of the recommendation that there will be full public consultation announced in coming months, and that gives me a degree of comfort. And I'm sure everyone in the community will get their chance to have their say on this issue. And I welcome that. So I remain in support. Thank you, Your Worship, and appreciate again the work of officers in that's gone into preparing this paper. Thank
you. Microphone. So we have a mover and a seconder. I now ask, we've had the discussion, so I'm going to put the motion to the vote. All those in favour of 2, 3, 4 and 5, please say aye. Aye. Contrary? Do you wish it recorded? Councillor McPherson against. The motion is carried. Thank you, and thank you for the amount of work. I'm very aware of the exhaustive process that we are going through, and I do really believe that Rotorua could be very well placed to put forward something that is quite unique about our place in any future iteration. Thank you. Move now to the resolution to go into public excluded. And I'll just state, thank you, moved Councillor Rokoa Tate, seconded Councillor Yates. I'll cover, there are 3 items for consideration: the confidential minutes of the meeting on the 26th of August, recommendations from other committees, stormwater contract and financial contributions for reserve purposes. And the reasons are commercial sensitivity, to enable commercial or industrial negotiations and to protect a person's privacy. We've had a mover and a seconder. All those in favour, please say aye. Contrary? Carried. And we'll have a 5-minute break. Yes, or do you want a little bit longer or 5 minutes? Just indicate to me. There is no morning tea, sorry. So time to clear your